This Week in Radio Tech, episode 140, is brought to you by the Telos Zip 1 IP audio codec. The Zip 1 is the best way to hear from there over the public internet. Low delay, astounding quality. On the web at telos-systems.com.
And now, our feature presentation.
Twert.
Would you take a vacation in a ham shack? An incredible ham shack. And where did you go to buy an AM transmitter back in the 1930s?
All right, calm down. He says that to everyone.
This calls for immediate discussion.
What's up, Doc?
All your days are belong to us.
From his palatial office of important business,
or in a choice hotel in a distant land,
this is Kirk Harnack.
Mark Persons joins Chris Tobin, Tom Ray, and me on this War Stories edition, where the stories are more about peacetime engineering.
You're dialed in to This Week in Radio Tech.
It's time for This Week in Radio Tech. Hi there, I'm Kirk Harnack, your host, and really glad to be with you. We've got a great show. Every 10 shows we do this. We have a lot of fun by doing a War Stories episode. It's stories from the trenches of radio advertising. Not radio advertising, radio engineering. What's in my head? Radio engineering. And I'll tell you which can be a lot more harrowing than radio advertising, since I've done both. And every time we do one of these War Stories episodes, we try to get a guest on the show so we get some new war stories. Well, our guest this week has been with us before on a couple earlier episodes of This Week in Radio Tech, but he's always got war stories. Let's go ahead and bring him right in. Let's introduce from Brainerd, Minnesota, fresh from the Wisconsin Broadcasters Clinic in Madison, it's Mark Persons. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Kirk. Always good to see you. And by the way, I have to warn the listeners that I did pick up a little cold, so don't get too close to the screen. I might just be so if you don't want a cold, just kind of stay away from the screen. But you can watch from a distance. It's okay.
Well, as we get into the show, Mark, you're going to have a couple of big subject matters for us. One has to do with a pretty incredible ham radio expedition or camp or something, and you'll explain about that. And then you've got some stories and pictures to share from broadcast facilities in the 1930s, and both of these are just terrifically interesting. So I can't wait to get you into telling these stories. But before we do, I need to introduce a couple of other regular co-hosts on the show. The best dressed engineer in radio from Manhattan, New York. It's my friend and yours, Chris Tobin. Hey, Chris.
Hello, Kirk. Hello, Mark. Hope everybody's doing well.
We are.
Oh, good. Yeah, I just have to sort of play along. I have a blank screen for return video, so I'm just listening carefully.
It's an audio podcast. Just pretend.
That's fine.
So, Chris, understand you're going to be in San Francisco here in a few weeks for the AES convention.
Yes, I have the pleasure of sitting on a panel for audio codecs. It'll be, I think, Sunday afternoon. You're there with me as well. It should be good. It should be fun.
I think it will be. Well, also, our other co-host, by the way, Chris, don't hesitate to jump in and pose a question or a complaint at Mark when he's telling his war stories. You may want to think of a little war story yourself, too, Chris, if you hadn't already for this episode. We may need one of your little filler stories from radio in the big city in market number 1. Also with us from market number 1, but he's at his house in the Hudson Valley of New York. Let's say hi to Tom Ray. Hello, Tom.
Hey, hello, Kirk. Hello, Chris. Hello, Mark, and everyone else. And good evening. It's great to be here. At my age, it's great to be anywhere. But anyway,
looks like you're in your ham shack.
Yes, I'm sitting at my desk. My ham stuff is behind me, and the tower we've been talking about forever, it's getting stood up Sunday.
Oh, which tower we're talking about forever?
The
refresh my old memory?
28-foot tower I'm putting up outside the house.
Oh, okay. And this is for which ham band or purpose?
Actually, there'll be a tri-band antenna on top, which is 10, 15, and 20 meters. And off on a couple of side arms, there'll be a 220 antenna and a 2-meter antenna. And we're even going to put a little red light on top because real towers have to have a flashing red light on top.
Hey, believe it or not, I've got, you can believe it, I've got a beacon, a full-size 300-millimeter code beacon here just outside the office here. I've been thinking about putting it.
I got one in the garage. My wife keeps asking me what I'm going to do with it. I told her I'm going to mount it on the deck and piss off the neighbors.
Sure. Well, not as bad as a strobe light would.
That's true.
Do the strobes at night.
Actually, it might come in handy on Halloween just to, shut off all the lights in the house and let this thing just go bzzz, bzzz.
Oh, yeah, that would be weird. Oh, that would be weird. I don't have a flasher for mine. Do you have a flasher for yours?
Not right now, but I can get one easy enough.
Yeah, okay.
You can either go solid state or you can go the old mechanical method. And
Get the
mechanical
mercury
method is cool
ball
because
one.
it goes click, click, click.
Chris Tobin, I'm sorry, what'd you say about the mechanical one?
Get the mechanical ones with the semicircle with the little mercury tube, and then just go back and forth. The rockers back and forth.
It's hypnotizing to watch that.
Oh, it's a hoot.
Yeah, the little rocker arm and the little mercury bulb that just goes back and forth like this. Yeah, it's so weird. And then every time the mercury breaks the contact inside there, you see that arc, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's jump right into our show. Oh, by the way, I want to tell you that our program is brought to you by the folks at Telos, and a product that I'm really tickled with and proud of, and that is the Telos Zip 1. We'll tell you more about it about halfway through the show. But now a man who certainly is no stranger to rhythmic arcing, that's Mark Persons. Hey, Mark, glad you could join us on This Week in Radio Tech, our War Stories episode.
Always glad to be here. You're a fun show to be on. It's good stuff.
Well, as far as I know, we're the only show to be on to talk about
I see.
radio.
So you have no competition? Is that the plan there?
We're the best show and the worst one too. Yeah.
And I should tell you that I actually have 2 towers on my property here. One of them's outdoors. It's a 64-footer, which is a whole different story. But I actually have a 19-foot tower in the house.
What?
In the entryway, I've got 19 feet of Roan 25 tower, and it goes between the first floor and the second floor. And really, it was an area for an elevator if it ever happened in the future, if I ever got old and needed help getting to the second floor.
Yeah.
So we've got this piece of tower sitting in there, and it's in the entry, as I said, and there's an on-air sign on it. I don't have any good photos for you right now. You're just going to have to visualize it. But there's an on-air sign, and then at the top, I have a genuine tower light. Now, since it's only 19 feet tall, if I put a 3-foot beacon at the top, all of a sudden, it just wouldn't look right. So what I've done is I have one of the shorter, like the 112-watt lights, and I put like a 40-watt light bulb in there. So it comes on, and it's red, and it's a great fun for people who come to visit.
You're married to a lady who is also an engineer, right?
Well, she's a very smart woman who knows a lot about engineering, and she is a ham, too. She is Whiskey Zero Hotel Alpha, and I'm Whiskey Zero Mike Hotel. So she is an extra class ham, and she did it by passing the 20-word a minute code test too.
Oh my goodness! Wow. Hey, this is one of those war story shows where we're going to talk. Our subject is going to look like it's about ham radio, and there's people who are engineers who are enamored with ham radio, and there's some people who just don't care anything about it. Think it's yesterday's technology, and why would I want to do that when I got a cell phone? But a lot of times we get into a ham radio story that we can relate very well into broadcast. So many hams, as you told me earlier today, Mark, hams back in the day, back in the 30s that you're going to tell us about later, they were, and all engineers were ham operators. So, Mark, do you want to get into the story about your recent ham expedition to an island?
Oh, sure. Well, I saw it in QST, and there's a ham, George Ulm, W9 EVT, I believe, 80-some-year-old guy, but he has quite a place there. His wife has a bed and breakfast where, well, it doesn't have breakfast, but it's called Greengate Farm. It's on the north end of Washington Island, and for those who don't know where Washington Island is, it's off the northeast tip of Wisconsin. You remember Wisconsin has this little arm that sticks out to the northeast? Well, anyway, it's called Door County. And then there's this 6-mile gap or so between there and this island that's about 6 miles across. And they're on the northern tip of this island. And the interesting part is they're only about 5 miles from the eastern time zone. But that's another story unto itself. So she runs this resort, so to speak, with they can have like 3 or 4 families in cabins and all of that kind of stuff. And then he has his ham shack, and he's been collecting radios for a long, long time. This guy claims to have close to 1,000 radios. He's got a lot of history there. But in addition to that, he is an avid ham operator. So he's got some of the latest digital radios. He even has this huge, well, wait a minute, there's some photos to show too. Did you go to gilbertlodge.com to find the photos?
Yeah, Andrew's getting that ready right now to show those. Okay. You'll see them first as the rest of us on the show are looking at a few-second delay. So as soon as you see Andrew bring a photo up, you just jump right in and talk about it. I saw these before the show, and they're remarkable, all these. Wow. Maybe you tell Andrew what to zoom in on, and he'll... Well,
first of all, there's the sign in the parking lot just to the right of the first photo, and it says... ham operator, parking only, all others will be squelched.
Squelched, yeah.
That's it. And then to the left of that is the photo of the ham building. Its one and only purpose is ham radio, amateur radio, and it's a good-sized building, and that's where he stores all of these rigs, including the ones that you operate at. So you can go down a little bit further. These are photos of some of it. All these rigs lined up along the wall. Now, the truth is that most of them are on display. But I remember those radios from the 1950s. Actually, I was first licensed in 1963. After passing the exam in 62 in front of a stone-faced operator, that's the way it was back then. Anyway, so there's George just coming up, and those are some of his Collins radios. He has a complete room with just Collins radios. Can you believe that? And then further down, there's me operating, and to the right-hand side, there's a black computer monitor, and with that you see all the important parameters from the radio, including the S meter and the frequency you're on and all that kind of stuff. And so I operated upper sideband. Most of the contacts were on 20 meters. For the time that I had available for me, I made, and I'm kind of a rag chewer rather than make a contact and go on to the next one. 36 contacts, most of them in this country, but I think 10 of them were to outside the country, like France, England, Isle of Man, all kinds of places. Lots of fun talking to people. The only difficult part about making contacts internationally is that you have to tune in your ears to these people because they have accents. They're speaking in English, but sometimes it's difficult, especially if you have a hearing disability. It's not easy. So anyway, so that was fun. But we wound up talking, running a kilowatt into his mono band beams on 20 meters, which are very directional, lots of gain, and someone would call us back and say, give his call sign, and then but he was like S5. So George would figure out, or the guy would say he's in Florida, swing the beam around, 10 over 9, armchair copy from there on out. It was really great. We had a lot of fun. Okay, the lower picture there?
Yeah.
There's no room in the building because the building is so packed with radios.
Yeah.
In order to access the wiring from behind the radios, he had to install doors on the outside of the building just to get at the wiring. And that's George.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. And maybe Tom and Chris were curious about this too, but what I wanted to ask you is, you've got a few antennas outside and dozens of radios inside that work, and 100 or more that are on display only. So how does the wiring work? How do you say, hey, I want to use that radio for a while? What has to get done to hook that radio up to an antenna tuner and to the antenna?
I think he's down to about 10 or less actual radios he can use, and there's switches, banks of switches. What radio goes to what antenna? Does it go through a linear amplifier, or does it go straight to the antenna? Whatever. But George operates with power, so he usually leaves a linear amplifier in there for a full gallon of power.
So what did it become plain to you how the switching mechanism worked, or could you do it yourself, or did you always have to call George to come take care of it?
Well, being a guy who knows what he's doing, he didn't label things very well. So I'd say, say, don't we want to do this? Oh, yeah, it's this button over here. Well, if it was only labeled, I could have figured it out. But that's fine. It worked out fine. And he was kind, gracious, let me do all this operating, and had a great time. He knew right away that I was a ham operator because I used all the right lingo and did all the right things going on the air. Had a wonderful time. And I can't emphasize enough the fact that if you'd like to go to ham heaven, that's what I called it. You too can go there. You can rent a cabin for 2 nights and do the same thing that I did.
Now, here's another question I've got. In one of those pictures, and you pointed it out, that video monitor that showed the important operating parameters of one of the radios, that looked like one of the ICOMs, like an ICOM 7800. Was that what it was?
I believe it was a 7800 ICOM. That was somewhat irrelevant. I was just awed by the entire situation, and we were making contact, so who cares?
Well, so so my question has to do with what's the difference for you, because you've grown up through a lot of these different radios. What's the difference in operating a radio that, without a video display, like most of them, and especially an older one or one that may not have all the DSP filters and that kind of stuff? What's the difference in operating a radio from the mid 60s and a radio from 2011?
Oh, well, the radio was far more capable of making contacts without having adjacent channel problems and all of that, and very stable. You get into an old Swan radio, and you turn them on and you're on one frequency, and after 15 minutes you've moved down the band about 20 kilohertz. That's just normal. Well, that doesn't happen today. But really, the extra screen just makes you feel good, I guess, because you can see it all on the radio. It's just a show.
And I bet on the older rigs too, Mark, the SSB doesn't sit there quite right.
It's yeah, and this is very clean, and I always got really nice reports on audio quality, and of course, this radio did everything it could to make the audio quality excellent. So it was a wonderful experience for me. I highly recommend anyone who wants to go on a summer vacation that, gosh, you could just include that, and if the wife isn't a ham, but you can talk her into going to it, great. There's plenty to do on the island outside of that. You can go out kayaking and seeing the island. There's museums and restaurants and the whole business. It's a fun thing. Oh, and going over on a ferry. Now, there's another fun part about the whole thing. And you have to go back on a ferry. They don't have bridges to these kinds of islands, by the way.
So there's a website that you pointed us to. You want to give that website out?
Oh, in particular for...
if folks are interested in going to this island
I think there's a link on my website. It's Greengate Farm would be where you Google it.
Okay.
So, well, anyway, that was a funny, but that isn't really what I came here to talk about today, unless you want to talk about that forever.
No. Go on, please.
Well, for years and years, I've been enamored with how different ham radio is from broadcast and how much they are alike. Okay, let's start with licensing. Ham radio, you have to go through examination to get a license. And in broadcast, in order to get a license, there's no examination. Any idiot can do it if he's got money. So basically, it just takes money to get into broadcast. And you would hope that some broadcast owner would have had to go through some sort of an exam to know that, well, gosh, he's competent enough to know some of the FCC rules, so he won't do the wrong things, maybe? Okay. What are some of the other examples? Broadcast, you're assigned one frequency, and you're assigned a power level, and you've got to maintain that 90% to 105%. Very strict FCC rules, right? Okay. But if you're a ham, you have thousands of frequencies available to you, dozens of modes, upper sideband, lower sideband, CW, data, frequency shift keying, you name it, it's all there. And the power level is limited by only a maximum number, but as a ham, you're responsible to run the minimum amount of power to get the job done. That's just the way it's supposed to be.
Can you imagine broadcasters every day trying to figure out the minimum amount of power to get the job done?
Yeah.
Hey, I want to bring Chris Tobin in because, Chris, you used to take care of a facility that had several transmitters. How would you determine that on the Empire State Building? What's the minimum power required to get the job done?
Well, in broadcast, since it's a for-profit operation, minimum powers are never mentioned. So how high can you go?
We need every watt to get the job done.
And oh, by the way, it isn't for-profit. Amateur radio, you're not allowed to do anything for profit. Period.
Yeah. Yeah. Not even carry a message for a commercial entity, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So if I called you and said, Mark, I need you to get some word out to all my cement mixer drivers that they need to come home now.
I'd say, who's going to pay for the violation?
Yeah, there you go. Okay. So on this subject of comparing and contrasting skills and operating requirements, licensing, I'm always interested in the skill set. What if someone's interested in a career where either at a radio station or in the field of broadcasting, whether it's TV or radio, or maybe getting into being an engineer for one of the cell phone carriers, something that has to do with communication. We whether or not the radio industry as we know it today has a bright future, I don't know. Some people say absolutely yes. Some people say no. It's going to be taken over by internet on your dashboard someday, and there will be a lot less need for broadcasters. Whatever the case may be, there's always going to be a need for people to design, install, maintain, repair, take care of the equipment and systems that get entertainment and information out to a mass audience, whatever that may look like in the future. So how much of the skills needed to do those kind of things relate to ham radio skills?
Well, if you look at it, the same laws of physics apply and the same terms apply. Viswar, reflected power, all that kind of thing. And they're all using cables, coaxial cables, wires, microphones, everything. So really, what I tell everyone is that what in ham radio absolutely applies to broadcast and vice versa. And what I'm struck with when I've been out in the field is that here I've got a problem in the field. Well, gosh, I had that same problem with my ham station, and I know how to fix it because the two are so together. And and I should digress a little bit back to, and we'll be talking about some of those pictures from the 1930s, but my father started in the 1920s in broadcasting, and he said when I was young that back then all broadcast engineers were hams, not just some, but all. It was just assumed that every one of them was a ham, and they were. And so for this network that he was involved with, there would be like a monthly newsletter, and in that newsletter it would say, oh, these are the problems we ran into. This is how we fixed them. Great. And, oh, by the way, at the end of the newsletter, here's a list of all of the engineers and the cities that they're in. The station in Hayward, Wisconsin, the engineer there is blah, blah, blah. And these are the crystals that he has for his ham rig. So when you want to find him on the ham band, that's where you'll find him on those frequencies because everything was crystal controlled. And oh, by the way, I don't know if many people know today that back then you would transmit on what frequency you got, and the other guy had a frequency somewhere up the band, okay? So you'd listen to him on one part of the band, and you'd be transmitting on the other part of the band. So that's the way it was. I mean, there was no easy, VFOs for moving your frequency around. I mean, you just had to live with those results. And most of the time it was CW. But then as broadcast engineers were broadcast engineers, they learned how to do phone, which in those days was AM radio, just like all broadcast stations back there were AM. There were no FMs. And so that helped them perfect their abilities to build and upgrade broadcast transmitters. One applied to the other.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I know that Tom Ray can probably speak to us and has several times on the show before about the skills that he uses as a broadcast engineer and how they relate to ham radio operating and vice versa. And I think one of those that I've always, a lot of engineers think is kind of a black art is the idea of, hey, one of my antennas has fallen down for an AM station. One of my towers is down, or my only tower is down, and I've got to string up a temporary antenna. Tom Ray, can you speak to that a little bit? Your skills as a ham operator in whipping up a temporary antenna?
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things we do with our ham club every year on field day, we go to this park here in the Newburgh, New York area. It's called Cronomer Hill Park, and there's a flagpole in this park. It's about 45, 50 feet tall, and we were up there one day, doing the pre-field day survey, and one of the guys said, it'd probably make a pretty neat antenna, but it's grounded. It wouldn't work. And I looked at him and I said, want to bet? So I brought a couple of coils and a nice big fat vacuum variable capacitor one day and up to field day, and brought up some line. I actually modeled the antenna. I took a look at the well, let's call it a tower. I took a look at the tower on software and said, okay, let's see. It looks to be about the right length for 40 meters, and I want to feed it as kind of an off-center fed dipole with a slant wire, which is no longer allowed for AM stations in the United States, but it used to be. And I said, okay, if we feed that and make the feed point about 10 feet up, and where the 10 feet came from was that we usually have an 8-foot ladder, and about 10 feet is about as high as I can reach if I'm on the top of it. Mm-hmm. What would it do? Well, it showed that the feed point resistance or impedance would be about 83 ohms and about 159 capacitive. That's easy to tune. Did some calculations and sat there and set the coils. No, I'm sorry. It was inductive. So I set the two caps, set the coil, tweaked it in, 50 ohms J0, which comes out to an SWR of 1:1, and we fed it with 5 watts. And the first contact on CW was Hawaii. So I guess it worked.
I guess so.
But you could take that and apply that to the case you just gave. Your tower came down. Well, what do you do? Well, you could put up a slant wire. You'd have to run significantly less power because there's going to be a takeoff angle on that, which could cause some interference, especially at night. So you'd have to discuss it with the FCC. But you could get back on the air using a wire and a couple of capacitors and a coil. And some signals better than none in the case of a major disaster.
Mark, have you ever had to run a long wire as a temporary AM antenna?
I did do that, and it worked fine. We knew we had a problem. The tower had major problems, and I thought, well, the tower crew has got to work on this thing anyway, and why don't I just string up a long wire, which I did. And so for 6 hours, they ran off this long wire while I had the tower problem fixed, and then we moved back to the tower. But here's another interesting example. I was at a radio station that I needed to reconfigure the antenna coupling network, the AM, and I knew it was going to take 4 or 5 hours of work. And gosh, Rush Limbaugh was going to be on the air that day, and you know how important that is for management. So what did I bring with me? I brought with me a 1,000 watt ham antenna tuner. And I used that in place of the antenna coupling network and ran a kilowatt through it until I got everything all fixed in the antenna coupling network and switched back to it later. But it kept the radio station on the air, and there's a piece of ham gear doing all this. Over.
Yeah. I just remembered I had a similar experience in American Samoa. I had to make a long wire antenna work on, I think it was it was on 648 kilohertz because they're in an area with 9 kilohertz spacing, and I just had to make a long wire work, and I knew that before I went there. So from MFJ, I bought a fairly cheap antenna tuner that would handle 100 watts or so, because I think we just had a 30-watt transmitter, one of those little, I forget the brand name, one of those little 30-watt transmitters, and tuned it up well enough to work. It wasn't perfect, but all the parts were there. I think I ended up changing one part to get it to load up fairly well. Hey, if you've just tuned in, you're watching This Week in Radio Tech. We're talking about war stories. It's episode number 140, and every 10 episodes we talk about war stories, things from the field that have happened that we've been able to solve or learn something from. And our guest on this show is Mark Persons. Our co-hosts who are with us are Tom Ray and Chris Tobin. We're going to get to some more war stories. In fact, Mark is going to relate to us some stories back from the 1930s. Not that he was there, but he's got pictures and stories about engineers from the 1930s coming up. This episode is brought to you by my employer and the good folks at Telos Alliance. They're makers of the Telos Zip 1, which is an IP codec. It's designed to work over the public internet, and it's designed to provide the lowest possible delay for two-way broadcasting at the highest possible bit rate over whatever connection that you've got with the public internet. So you don't have to get ISDN lines. You don't have to get a special, high speed, a T1 or some kind of other expensive connection or a point-to-point data connection. You can actually use the public internet for low delay remote broadcasts. I got a story here from a fellow named Dave Barnett from KVMR in Nevada City, California. He was using a couple of Zip 1s recently to do a Celtic Fest broadcast from Grass Valley, California. And I was asking him about, hey, Dave, how did this work out for you? Were you able to use a good high bit rate, or were you limited to a lower bit rate on the audio coding? Dave was using basically a form of WiMAX out in Grass Valley, California. They couldn't get a wired internet connection, so they had to use a wireless connection. And here's what Dave said. He wrote back to me. He said, we kept the bit rate at 192 kilobit per second AAC. He says, and frankly, we had a killer weekend off Celtic Festival using the Zip 1, and we did use a 5-second minimum delay setting because it was on a wireless WiMAX, and there'd be occasional data dropouts, but using the 5-second delay, we didn't get audio dropouts. He says, quote, the broadcast was nothing short of fantastic, not one single audio dropout. The band even said our over-the-air broadcast sounded like a live CD. I wanted you to know that this little box is probably the most impressive thing anyone around here has ever heard, and by lengthening the delay, we eliminated the last of our issues. We're trying to figure out a way to get budget for or get somebody to donate another pair of these, and we'll never have to do another broadcast again via ISDN. Thanks for all your help. Dave had written into our support department for some ideas on getting rid of a couple dropouts. And since they were on wireless, I jumped in and suggested that they just try a higher delay or a lower bit rate. The higher delay worked just fine for them. I have another story that Dave wanted to relate. He said that the first time we ever used the Zip 1 for real, it was the last summer, and the show was the legendary British guitarist Albert Lee, live from the Sierra Nevada Brewery in Chico, California. His playing style and dynamics are such that it really exercises a lossy codec, much more than a lot of program material. He said, we were nervous about how the Zip 1s would work, so we split the signal, and we used both dial-up ISDN using our old Zephyrs, as well as the Zip 1s at 192 kilobits AAC. That was connected to a DSL line at the brewery. Back at the studio, we compared the two feeds. I remember it like yesterday, and the difference, Dave says, was amazing. So much so I called the GM in the studio and had him listen to the AB feed, and we knew we had stumbled across something fantastic. Of course, we ran the show off the Zip 1s and used the ISDN codecs as a backup. Well, reason there is the ISDN codecs. He has some older ones that were doing MP3 at 128 kilobits, and the Zip 1s were doing AAC at 192. So glad to have this success story from Dave Barnett in California. Really glad that he's gotten such a good utility out of the Zip 1s. If you want to check them out for yourself, they're on the Telos website. Go to telos-systems.com and look for the Zip 1. I've got a couple of them right here in the office, and in fact was just playing with them today. Great product. If you got to get audio from here to there and do it over the public internet, wireless, LTE, I use them over WiMAX here pretty frequently, and they're just great. I appreciate the folks at Telos for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. Hey, we haven't chatted too much with Chris Tobin. Chris, am I going to be able to put you on the spot right now for a quick war story, something that happened either recently or in your long-distant past that we might learn a little lesson from?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, that's no problem for me, actually. I could give you one from in the past. That probably would be fun, if you're game.
I'm game.
Excellent. Well, here's one for you. As Tom knows, here in New York City, every July 4th, Macy's department store puts on the July 4th fireworks. And from time to time, it's either on the East River between Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, or the last couple of years, it's been in the Hudson River between New York State and New Jersey. So one year, the radio station I was working for, we do a broadcast every year. And we set up the typical, tent, table, standard outside broadcast fare. Well, relying on the local phone carrier, the name will remain nameless, but they were formerly known as New York Telephone, Bell Atlantic, 9X, something else after that. We ordered the typical ISDN line and a couple of POTS lines. And again, we're in a park on the Hudson River. Very standard stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. We did site survey. Phone company came out a week earlier. By the way, we're working with NBC Television. They're the TV folks that put on the broadcast and everything else. So we work side by side with them. And we're getting ready. Day of broadcast. Everything appears to be doing well. Then suddenly we lose all telecom. Not sure why. What happened? Try to contact the phone company service number. Remember, we're broadcasters, though we're not consumers, not customers on a residential circuit. So this is special services or business account or enterprise accounts, depending on who you talk to. Try to call for help. I'll put it in simple terms. I reached several people that informed me they could not help me. There's nobody's in. The office is closed. It's July 4th weekend. Aren't you aware of the holiday? And I was like, okay, I thought I was calling the broadcast division or the broadcast group of the phone company. Yes, this is it. So you do know that we're doing a broadcast. It's July 4th. Yes, it's a holiday. Okay, do you understand where I'm coming from? I can't help you. Everybody's gone. There's no one here that can help you. The office is closed.
Oh my.
I said, okay, fine. That's how you want to be. So I proceeded over to see a buddy of mine at NBC, and I said to him, I have a little predicament. Can you help me out? Now, they're doing satellite uplinking to the network for the July 4th broadcast. So here we are, radio station, New York City. In the end, we wind up getting on their 4th channel audio of the satellite link. The audio is sent up to the satellite, downlinked at 30 Rockefeller Center, brought across on an ISDN codec to our studios in downtown Manhattan, and put on the air on the radio for everyone to hear in the New York City metropolitan area. So from the lower Manhattan on the Hudson River, our audio went from there, 22,000 miles into the sky and back, and down to 30 Rockefeller Center and off to our transmitters in New Jersey for everyone to hear on the radio. In the last minute, that was the hours before broadcast was to begin, midday of July 4th.
Wow. That's a lot of bouncing around to get the signal anywhere. Goodness
yeah,
gracious.
Yeah. Now, I will say, and for those listening are like, wow, that's pretty cool. You got NBC to help you out. I will, for full disclosure, the radio station and NBC local, I'll call them local engineering, technical managers, we have worked together on several other shows here in New York City on many occasions. So we built a relationship with the local guys, actually network guys. So when I went to them and said, hey, I need a hand, I'm in a predicament, and they could relate because they too were having problems with the local phone carrier regarding their telecom needs. So both of us were in the same boat. They just happen to have a bigger boat with a dish that can give them connectivity they needed. The telecom stuff was sort of ancillary. For me, it wasn't the case. So they related, understood. They said, we can help you out. And it turns out that the two guys I was working with were former radio guys. They used to be in radio before they went to television. So after I told him what happened, he's like, look, know exactly where you're coming from. When I worked in XX Market, we had the same issues with the phone company back then. Give me 20 minutes, and I'll have you what you need. I was like, gotcha. I walk away. I come back. Production assistant calls me over and says, here's where you plug in your audio. We're ready. That was it. So the moral of the story is always have a plan B, maybe sometimes plan C, and make sure you build a good relationship with the local guys in town, whether they're in radio or TV, because you never know when you may need a professional courtesy call.
That does sound like great advice. And one way to build those relationships is go to your SBE meetings.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
Plenty of your friends or people who ought to be your friends are there. And by the way, I don't know about other chapters, but so far I've never been to an SBE chapter that shunned an engineer from another discipline, like a telephone carrier engineer or a cable television engineer or a student who is just interested in engineering. In other words, every SBE chapter I've been to, you're welcome. So you want to learn something and learn who the other people are in town around you, upon whom you might depend someday, maybe even for a job. Those SBE meetings are sure valuable.
Absolutely. And speaking of the professional courtesy, I'll mention also Tom Ray, who's on this netcast. He and I have worked together on a couple of occasions in the same capacity. I reached out to him, and his studios overlooked a particular roadway here in New York City called Broadway. And on several occasions, there have been parades for various sporting events, or sporting teams that have won, maybe in football and baseball. And he's been very kind, and they offered our access to his window ledge so we can broadcast what we saw on Broadway. And the same is true for 9/11 memorial services. The other side of his building looks out onto the pit. And thanks to Tom and the folks that helped us out with that. But I just wanted to get the point across that you never know who you may need help from, and you always return the courtesy, and that's how it works. So you could either be in radio or television, and I've worked with cable television folks as well and done the same thing. So for a war story, that's yes, it was crazy going by a satellite, but as far as professional courtesy and building relationships, that's key. And I think if you don't do that, you'll definitely find yourself out in the cold and probably out of a job, or at least trying to defend your existence with your boss.
Tom's a good guy. He'll if you ask him a favor, he'll usually say yes as long as it's in his best interest and not too much trouble.
You bet.
Yes. Yeah, there's a certain lunch, or sometimes a dinner, and there's other things we can't talk about.
Tom, I think I bought you lunch a couple times.
Oh, you bet you did.
What's the name of that? What's the name of that incredible restaurant in the basement of the building you're in?
Suspenders.
That's it. Suspenders. Holy cow!
Their soup is great, isn't it?
Yeah. Their soup is
so's
great.
the bar.
So's the bar. Yeah,
Yes,
I think we had a beer there once.
The beer is fresh.
All right. Well, let's get back to the war story at hand, and Mark Persons is with us from Brainerd, Minnesota. And Mark is if you've been around the industry very long, you know Mark. In fact, I just read an article that you wrote, Mark, in Radio World about how to properly put a connector on the end of a piece of coax. What a great tutorial.
Well, it's kind of you to say. It seems that people these days just don't really know that discipline very well. In fact, it's quite frequently that a real broadcast engineer will call and say, "Oh, make me a 5-foot cable with an N connector on one end and a B and C on the other end." I says, "Fine, I'll make it up today and put it in the UPS, and you'll have it tomorrow," or whatever it is. And I got to thinking, there isn't much expertise out there. And so maybe an article in Radio World would help people understand that kind of thing. And being an old school guy, I wrote it for connectors that are soldered on, not crimped on. And because I have some very special feelings about that, you'll see that in the article when you look at it. So it's a lot of fun to write to. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that I was at the Broadcasters Clinic in Madison. No, it's not a doctor show. It was for broadcast engineers, and Chris Tarr was there too, and a lot of TV guys there, a lot of radio guys, and who knows, there were people from other disciplines as well. So it was a good get together. Everyone got along, no fist fights. It was well worth going to. In fact, I rate it, with my limited experience, I rate it the best regional show anywhere in the country. And that's how they tout themselves to be, too. In Madison, Wisconsin, the list of attendees was about very close to 250. Isn't that amazing, huh?
I don't know. Is that amazing?
Well, I think it is. For a not too well populated area, you have to remember we're in the 100 kilowatt FM area, and the reason for that is they don't have many people out here.
That's right. You got to reach a big area to.
That's right. And so if you're in New York, it doesn't take many kilowatts, and they don't allow many kilowatts to reach the population there. So that's the difference. And 2,000-foot towers are allowed here with 100 kilowatts.
Wow.
If you can afford it.
Yeah. Well, I've been to a few of those Madison broadcasters clinics, and yes, they are attended by a really good class of engineers. A lot of guys who get it, and if they don't get it, they are there to learn. So it's a very worthwhile thing, and too bad it's passed up for this year. So maybe now's a good time to mark it on your calendar for next year. I'm sure if you Google Wisconsin Broadcasters Clinic, you'll find some reference to it for next year. Hopefully, they've set the date.
One more thing on that. Was it last year or was it the year before? It was an SBE national convention, so it drew a lot more people then too. And they've got a bid in, I believe, for 2014 to be the national SBE convention again. So we'll see how that plays out. But anyway, it was great, lots of fun. And one of the tongue-in-cheek presentations was really fun. It was about tube electronics and audio, and it was very well done. I can't remember who did it, but it was just terrific. And it's all in your ears, whether you like tube sound or whether you like a solid state sound. But it was just fun and fascinating to listen to this guy who was a non-believer in tube and vinyl sound, and he just bought something on a whim and decided to try it out, and fell in love with that sound. But it's a different sound. My example about that is that you could take an audio source and listen to it with headsets, and it sounds like this, and then you move it, and you put it through a solid state amp and listen to it. Yep, sounds the same. And you go through 10 of these solid state amps, and yep, sounds the same at the end. And then you pass it on to a tube amplifier and listen to the output of that. It's different. Well, different is different. And if you like that sound, great. But it's not the original sound. So you just
You're right. I love that. It's not the original sound, but you're right about that advice. Different is different. I think we just found the name for the podcast.
Oh, okay.
War stories.
Okay.
Different is different. I like that.
Yeah. Well, okay. And then I've got another quick story here. The microphone I'm using.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I described this one other time. It's a Gates G100. It goes back to a radio station that I helped build in 1964. And that was back in the days when Gates Radio would sell you everything. They'd sell you everything from the microphone right out to the tower. Everything. And, of course, those days are gone, too. And RCA was doing that many, many years ago, too. And they got out of the radio business in 1980, as you well know. But this is actually an Electro Voice microphone. I can't remember the model number, but according to this, it's a Gates G100. Oh, boy. Well, anyway, that goes on and on and on. But where else were we? Oh, we were going to talk about
look at those pictures
radio
from the 1930s.
pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you can find those photos, I'll show you some that my father took in about 1935, WEBC, Duluth, Minnesota. And that was back when AM was the only radio medium. But interestingly enough, and I don't have the specifics on it, but along about 47 or 48, they actually turned on one of the first FM transmitters in the country. Well, it was prompted by Edwin Armstrong starting what did they call that? The Yankee Network on the East Coast.
Uh-huh.
And so there was interest. But it was experimental in Duluth, and it was on the old band. I think it was like 42 megahertz, something like that. And then FM changed and went to the 100 megahertz band, the 3-meter band, as hams would say, right? Anyway, it's not 2 meters, it's not 6 meters, it's 3 meters. Well, 100 megahertz, what do you expect? Well, anyway, if you can find those photos, I can describe them to you. And if we can put them on the screen, it's mwpersons.com. Go to the section called Our Office.
Our Office, yeah, down at the bottom.
And then down toward the bottom, a little bit to the left, it's 1930s photos.
I've shared the link with Andrew, and so he's busily scurrying to crank up the computer and get the hamster running and get the picture up right now.
So again, my father started in the 1920s, and they did something interesting back then for Duluth, Minnesota. They started building extra stations. Hayward, Wisconsin, Rice Lake, Wisconsin, you name it. Okay, the top one. All right, there we go. Transmitter plant for WEBC radio in Superior, but licensed to Duluth. Do you see those cars there? Isn't that
Yes!
priceless? Isn't that great? And look at those tiny garages. I mean, today we have garages. Back then they had a place that you could hardly get out of the car of when you wanted to store it so it didn't get snowed on or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, next photo down will be worth seeing too. More of the same, only, okay, this is, get this, this is a 5,000 watt AM transmitter, and I believe that is my father in the background there.
Really?
Yeah, he designed this transmitter. Now, this is back in the day when you didn't buy transmitters, or very few bought transmitters. This thing actually was a Class A linear for 5 kilowatts, driven by some lower power level. The efficiency of that transmitter had to be near zero. By the way, can you go back to that photo, if you don't mind? And on the desk there, a little hard to see, but there are some candlestick telephones.
I saw those 2 phones sitting there. What in the world?
Isn't that great? But this is a hand-built transmitter, and basically it's one floor of a building, and this is the part where it was safe to go around and check the meters, and the back part, that was where all the high voltage was, where you'd walk around and figure out what was going wrong with the transmitter. And that was normal. That was the way it was done. Okay. Next.
Have you any idea what that transmitter cost to build?
Oh, I have no idea. But these were
those were the days when
hand-built.
transmitters were real transmitters. Good Lord.
Yeah. And the truth is, they didn't sound that good. I mean, they didn't have feedback, audio feedback to lower the distortion and all that. I mean, this was all new technology at the time. All right, next photo. That is a control room. That's not where the announcer is. This is a control room where the operator sits and looks through 1 or 2 windows to other studios. And the racks and racks of equipment have, you can see it there, patch panels for audio. And in the corner of the room, a Western Union clock, because they tied in as an earlier subscriber to, I believe, the NBC radio network. This was class act stuff back then.
Hey, look at the left-hand rack in that picture, the one on the farthest left, and there are 2 identical devices in that rack that have chromed like speaker grills on the left and right side of them. Now, I doubt those are stereo speakers behind there, but any idea what that would be?
You know, you got me on that one. I'd have to look at the original photo to kind of come up with that, but you know, it wasn't uncommon to use chrome and all that on what they had, and none of that equipment you could buy. You could buy patch panels, you could buy tubes, you could buy transformers and rack panels, but the rest of it you had to put together yourself. This isn't just something you buy. This is not plug and play.
Wow. You know, a few years ago, I got to get a tour of the WSM transmitter site here in Nashville, and it's been pretty modernized now, but I guess the first time I saw it was probably 20 years ago. And I met the old fella, I believe his name was Everett, who worked there pretty much full time. And in the basement of the building, they had a shop where they built one of their own transmitters, and they built transmitters for other stations. So they had lathes and metal bending equipment and all that kind of stuff, and they would build transmitters for other people. But let's go on with your story. You've got some more pictures, I believe, to show.
Oh, yes. Well, that brings up a good point. Because it was the Arrowhead Radio Network with maybe 10 stations, they had at least 1 and sometimes 2 full-time men, and they were called mechanics. They would take a schematic diagram and they would build it. Can you imagine that? And it was a full-time job for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
All you had to do is tell them how to do it. And they do that. Okay, next photo. See what we got. Okay. Well, who needs records or CDs? This is the way it was.
Isn't that
this was music back then. Look at that. The real thing.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people involved there. I mean,
plus the board operator. And what was the board operator? Did they have one mic on all that, or maybe a couple?
Might have, I don't know, but I don't see the microphones there either. They were, well, you probably just didn't see it. But the point is that was how they did live audio, and people were not expensive back then. People were the least expensive part of a radio station. Now people are the most expensive part. Look at how things have changed.
Sure.
Okay.
So I suppose back then when you had, and hey, I've engineered for some stations that were built, I guess, that were built in the late 40s, early 50s, and they still had studio rooms where bands would come in, but that was supplemental programming. That wasn't all the programming. But could you imagine working at a station where, hey, if somebody wasn't talking live or singing live or playing live, you had dead air?
Yes, and a lot of the early stations would just come on the air for a few hours a day. They'd have a schedule. We're going to be on, from 10 to noon, and then we're going to lunch, and then we'll come back and do some more programming for you.
Wow. What a concept.
Try that today.
I would have just let the iPod play while we were gone to lunch.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Is there another? I think there's at least one more photo to see there. Okay. This was a studio with the actors or the announcers, let's put it that way, and a piano. They all had a piano. And there they are. They're reading their scripts. Isn't that something? And actually, that's how my mother and father met. My mother was a non-paid radio actor. She was she had a bit part, and they just did it because it was fun to do. And you go to the radio station, they give you a script, and you read it. And I suppose some people got paid, but she didn't get paid. Well, guess what? My dad was at the radio station, and that ended. That's how I came about. So, funny how that happens, huh?
Wow, those pictures are just amazing. And these pictures were all from up in Minnesota or Wisconsin? Where were they?
WEBC Duluth, but you think of it as Duluth Superior.
Yeah.
And 1935 approximately. So,
Wow.
and he's passed away years ago, so I can't ask him any more questions, but I've got these things, and they're terrific.
Hey, I want to ask Tom Ray. Tom's been around WOR for a while. Tom, you've seen a lot of pictures around WOR of live performances there, haven't you?
Oh, you bet. Matter of fact, WOR back in the day, I guess, if you want to say that, was one of the flagship stations of the oh, good. Now I'm going to pull a blank here. of the Mutual Radio Network.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the program The Shadow was done in the building we occupied for 83 or 84 years at 1440 Broadway. And as a matter of fact, there's a very good book. Can't think of the author off the top of my head, but it's called The Great American Broadcast. And it describes the 1930s and doing the radio shows and how if you were an actor like Jack Benny, you had your own show. You didn't have to worry about this. But the Kirk Harnacks, the Tom Rays, and the Chris Tobins of the world, we were bit part actors. And sometimes you would have literally one line to read on every show, or not every show, but on three different shows on three different networks. And CBS and NBC were uptown, and those were easy to go shuttle between. But WOR was in Times Square. And what they used to do is they used to rent off-duty, not rent, but, hire off-duty ambulances to take them from uptown down to Times Square and then get them back uptown to do the next line on whatever next show they were. And sometimes these people were literally walking into the studio right before their line. They were handed a script, read the line, and walked out the door. So, can you imagine that today?
Chris Tobin, you never did any of that, did you?
No. Well, I did some college radio. That's about it. But nothing that dates back that far.
Oh my God! Well, I wasn't implying that.
No, I know. I'm only kidding. Well, I have to say, I worked with some folks, in television who came out of radio, and to comment about what Tom says with reading a script and walking out and do your thing. Interestingly enough, those of us who have done radio and even newspaper, when it comes to doing TV, it's almost more natural than you think. A couple of reporters I've worked with over the years, TV reporters, major anchors, came out of radio, and when they would do their stuff, the producer would say, "Hey, look, I need this segment to be 90 seconds. Write your story, whatever, but we need 90 seconds and go." And every time, like clockwork, they just did it, never failed. And the radio guys I traveled with, some radio news reporters, when we did television, the same thing. They loved it because they just go in, boom, boom, boom. Nowadays, I think we take so much for granted because it's a visual world. You lose sight of what radio sort of like tweaks the inner brain and makes certain things happen. It's just subconsciously. That's just my opinion.
Hey, earlier in the show, we were Mark was talking about his microphone, and Mark, I believe you said it had a Gates name on it. Was that right?
Yes, it's Gates G100.
And Mike Phillips in our chat room points out that he believes that it's actually an Electro-Voice manufactured microphone, an EV630. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah. The number comes to mind, and yes, it is an Electro-Voice microphone. It's a dynamic mic, right? Mm-hmm.
It has I'm looking at the specs right now. Mike Phillips passed the link along in the chat room, and it says the frequency response is uniform from 60 to 11 kilohertz.
Oh,
uniform.
Okay.
I'm not sure what uniform means exactly in this, but back then. But.
In other words, they didn't want to spec plus or minus how many decibels, right?
Yes, yeah, okay. Something like that. Oh, the diaphragm is made from a miracle compound called acoustalloy.
Oh, funny how they came up with names like that. And
no, it's great.
If you read any pill bottle today, you'll find they've really come up with names nowadays.
Oh yeah, sure. Wow, this is hey Mike, thanks in the chat room. He always passes along good stuff. So I need to put this link in the show notes for this microphone. Great pictures too. Okay, guys, we're really about out of time. I don't want to go long unless somebody's got something a little war story they need to add in here.
Oh, well, no, Kirk, I was going to say, if you go farther down that page on the mic, there's an actual graph of the frequency response, and it looks like uniform means plus or minus about 1 dB up to about, looks like to be about 7 kilohertz, where there's about a 2 dB bump, and then it rolls off real quick, starting around 11.
Yep, you're right. I just scrolled down and saw that. Well, there you go. Well, it certainly sounds fine. Hey, and Mark, we're getting a lot of comments on how great your camera looks. So good job.
Just blame Paula, my wife, who takes care of all these things. She is a real honey. She really is the other half of our business. Sometimes she's more than half of our business.
We've got a home cooked meal. We got a home cooked meal right here in Nashville for you if you and Paula want to come down and fix my camera.
Oh, is that so? And also, she's a great cook as well, which is another story all unto itself. So, anyway, always fun, good seeing you guys.
Well, thanks, Mark, for taking the time to get prepared and get these pictures together for us. I really appreciate it, and your stories are always welcome. And hey, if you want to find out how to put an N connector, it was an N, right? Correctly.
That was an article about N connectors, but gosh, the same technology is involved with BNC connectors. It's virtually identical.
Yeah.
So there's no reason why you couldn't use those same ideas.
Well, if you're like me, and I think you are, this is why you wrote that article, you've come across plenty of jumpers, some supposedly factory made, where you can grab the body of the connector and just spin it on the coax, and you think, this isn't doing its job.
And that's one of the statements in the article, is if you grip it and there is rotation afterward, then take it all apart and do it all over again.
Yeah. Well, it's a great article. It's in the newest Radio World magazine that was just delivered to your mailbox probably today, maybe yesterday, maybe tomorrow. I got mine today and read it before the show. So thanks, Mark, for that informative article. And I wish somebody would have written an article like that back, maybe 30 years ago when I was getting in this business. But after a few failures, I figured it out myself that how to put these things together, that they don't need to short and they don't need to spin and they do need to be soldered well, at least the
interestingly enough, I have open connectors like that put together by other people, and pieces are inverted. They're backwards on the inside. That ring that you pull the braid over on the coax, it's very common to see that in backwards. And of course, it doesn't work with beans when you do that.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for that. Hey guys, we're gonna have to go. Chris Tobin in Manhattan, thank you for your participation. Always appreciate you being here.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Look forward to next week.
And Tom Ray, also from New York, Hudson Valley. He calls home. Thanks for being here this evening.
Hey, you bet, Kirk. It's always fun. Mark, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again fairly soon.
And 73s.
And the man with the best camera in the podcasting business, it's Mark Persons. Thanks for being with us also, Mark. Appreciate it.
Just call Paula. She'll tell you how it's done. 73.
Okay. All right. You've been watching This Week in Radio Tech, episode number 140. It's a War Stories episode. And our show's been brought to you by the Telos Alliance and the Telos Zip 1 IP codec. Check it out online at telos-systems.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye, everybody.
That's all the bandwidth we can pilfer this week. Another twit has propagated, and all the transmitters and audio equipment live happily ever after, thanks to the handsome engineer and his kind, benevolent care. We'll be back next week.
Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
This Week in Radio Tech. Subscribe to iTunes and you'll never miss a show. Search for This Week in Radio Tech in the iTunes Store. Soliciting is strictly encouraged. If you like today's show, tell a friend. If you didn't like it, we were never here. Kirk Harnack's wardrobe provided by the Salvation Army and the Red Cross Disaster Relief Services. Hair and makeup provided by Penelope Garcia Hernandez Weinberg.
He's unique, wouldn't you say?
I just want to get it over with.
This ends this transmission. Tango, Whiskey, India, Romeo, Tango. Signing off. Okay.